So, hello and welcome back yet again to another evening with Mr. Charles Dickens, where I start off with an apology because we didn't get this chapter done yesterday, and I'm going to be sounding a little bit lispy today because I still can't get the bottoms back in. I pushed it a little bit too far the other day, even though everything hurt. I just jammed my teeth in and I just ripped up my bottom gums pretty darn bad. So until they heal, I'm gonna sound like an 8-year-old with a lisp. So apologies for that. But as long as we can all handle a little bit of a lisp, we can move on with this show. I don't know why I thought that getting my hard reline was going to be something that was simple. It feels like nothing in life is ever truly simple, so there we are. It is what it is, and all of that nonsense. But when we left the last time, it kind of looked like things were really heating up, which is a little bit exciting. It's nice to find a story as we dig through all of Mr. Dickens's words. I still haven't verified if it is actually true that Charles Dickens was paid by the word, but I can believe it. I mean, it's good to be a master of language, but sometimes you can use too many words. And to stop me from using too many words, I'm going to jump back in because, like I said, the story was heating up, and we are going to be jumping back into book 2 of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, titled The Golden Thread, with chapter 16, Still Knitting. Madame Defarge and Monsieur her husband returned amicably to the bosom of Saint Antoine, where a speck in a blue cap toiled through the darkness and through the dust and down the weary miles of avenue by the wayside, slowly tending towards that point of the compass where the chateau of Monsieur the Marquis, now in his grave, listened to the whispering trees. Such ample leisure had the stone faces now for listening to the trees and to the fountain that the few village scarecrows who, in their quest for herbs to eat and fragments of dead sticks to burn, strayed within sight of the great stone courtyard and the terrace staircase, had it borne upon their starved fancy that the expression of the faces was altered. A rumor just lived in the village, had a faint bare existence there, as did its people, that when the knife struck home, the faces changed from faces of pride to faces of anger and pain. Also, that when the dangling figure was hauled up 40 feet above the fountain, they had changed again and bore a cruel look of being avenged, which they would henceforth bear forever. In the stone face over the great window of the bedchamber where the murder was done, two fine dints were pointed out in the sculptured nose, which everybody recognized, and which nobody had seen of old, and on the scarce occasions when 2 or 3 ragged peasants emerged from the crowd to take a hurried peep at Monsieur the Marquis petrified, a skinny finger would not have pointed to it for a minute before they all started away among the moss and leaves, like the more fortunate bunnies who could find a living there. Chateau and hut, stone face and dangling figure, the red stain on the stone floor, and the pure water in the village well, thousands of acres of land, a whole Provence of France, all of France itself lay under the night sky, concentrated into a faint hairbreadth line. So does a whole world, with all its greatness and littleness, lie in a twinkling star. And as a mere human knowledge can split a ray of light and analyze the matter of its composition, so sublimer intelligences may read in the feeble shining of this earth of ours every thought and act, every vice and virtue of every responsible creature on it. The Defarges, husband and wife, came lumbering under the starlight in their public vehicle to that gate of Paris, whereunto their journey naturally tended. There was the usual stoppage at the barrier guardhouse, and the usual lanterns came glancing forth for the usual examination and inquiry. Monsieur Defarge alighted, knowing one or two of the soldiers there and one of the police. The latter he was intimate with and affectionately embraced. When Saint Antoine had again enfolded the Defarges in his dusty wings, and they, having finally alighted near the saint's boundaries, were picking their way on foot through the black mud and offal of the streets, Madame Defarge spoke to her husband. "Say then, my friend, what did Jacques of the police tell thee?" "Very little tonight, but all that he knows. There is another spy commissioned for our quarter. There may be many more, for all that he can say, but he knows of one." "Eh well," said Madame Defarge, raising her eyebrows with a cool, business-like air. "It is necessary to register him. How do they call that man?" "He is English." "All the better. His name?" "Bassard," said Defarge, making it French by pronunciation, but he had been so careful to get it accurately that he spelled it with perfect correctness. "Bassard," said the madame. "Good. Christian name?" "John." "John Bassard," said the madame, after murmuring it once to herself. "Good. His appearance isn't known?"
"Age, about 40. Height, about 5 feet 9. Black hair, complexion, dark. Generally rather handsome visage, eyes dark, face thin, long, and sallow. Nose aquiline but not straight, having a peculiar inclination towards the left cheek. Expression, therefore, sinister."
"My faith, it is a portrait," said Madame, laughing. "He shall be registered tomorrow." They turned into the wine shop, which was closed, for it was midnight, and where Madame Defarge immediately took her post at her desk, counted the small money that had been taken during her absence, examined the stock, and went through the entries in the book, made a few of her own, checked the serving man in every possible way, and finally dismissed him to bed. Then she turned out the contents of the bowl of money for a second time, and began knotting them up in her handkerchief in a chain of separate knots for safekeeping through the night. All this while Defarge, with pipe in mouth, walked up and down, complacently admiring but never interfering, in which condition, indeed, as to the business and his domestic affairs, he walked up and down through his life. The night was hot, and the shop, close shut and surrounded by such a foul neighborhood, was ill-seeming. Monsieur Defarge's olfactory sense was by no means delicate, but the stock of wine smelled much stronger than it ever tasted, and so did the stock of rum and brandy and aniseed. He whiffed the compounded scents away as he put down his smoked-out pipe. "You are fatigued," said Madame, raising her glance as she knotted up the money. "They're only the usual odors."
"I am a little tired," he said.
"You are a little depressed as well," said Madame, whose quick eyes had never been so intent upon the accounts, but they had a ray or two for him. "Oh, the men, the men!"
"But, my dear,"
said Defarge. But, my dear, said Madame, with a firm nod, but, my dear, you are faint of heart tonight, my dear. Well, then, said Defarge, as if a thought were wrung out of his breast, it is a long time. It is a long time, said his wife. And when is it not a long time? Vengeance and retribution require a long time. That is the rule. It does not take a long time to strike a man with lightning, said Defarge. How long, said Madame, does it take to make and store the lightning? Tell me. Defarge raised his forehead thoughtfully, as if there were something in that. It does not take a long time, said Madame, for an earthquake to swallow a town. Oh, well, but tell me how long to prepare the earthquake. A long time, I suppose. But when it is ready, it takes place and grinds to pieces everything in front of it. In the meantime, it is always preparing, though it is not seen or heard. This is your consolation. You may keep it. And she tied a knot with flashing eyes, as though throttling a foe. I tell thee, said Madame, extending her hand for emphasis, that although it is a long time on the road, it is on the road and coming. I tell thee it never retreats and never stops. I tell thee it is always advancing. Look around and consider the lives of all the world that we know. Consider the faces of all the world that we know. Consider the rage and discontent to which the Jacquerie addresses itself with more and more certainty every hour. Can these things last? Bah, I mock you. My brave wife, said Defarge, standing before her with his head a little bent, his hands behind his back, like a docile, attentive pupil. I do not question all of this, but it has lasted a long time, and it is possible, you know well, my wife, it is possible that it may not come during our life. Oh, well, how then? Demanded Madame, tying another knot, as if it were another enemy strangled. Well, said Defarge, half complaining and half apologizing, we shall not see the triumph. We will have helped it, said Madame, with her hand in action. Nothing that we do is done in vain, I believe. I believe with all my soul that we shall see the triumph, but even if I knew certainly not, show me the neck of an aristocrat and a tyrant, and still I would. And with that, Madame tied a very terrible knot indeed. Hold, said Defarge, reddening a little as if he felt charged with cowardice. I, too, my dear, will stop at nothing. Yes. But it is your weakness that you sometimes need to see your victim an opportunity to sustain you. Sustain yourself without that. When the time comes, let loose a tiger and a devil, but wait for the time with the tiger and devil chained and not shown, just always ready. Madame enforced the conclusion of this piece of advice by striking her counter with her chain of money as if she knocked its brains out, and then gathering the heavy handkerchief under her arm in a serene manner, and observing it was time to go to bed. The next day saw the admirable woman in her usual place in the wine shop, knitting assiduously. A rose lay beside her, and if she now and then glanced at the flower, it was with no infraction of her usual preoccupied air. There were a few customers, drinking or not, standing or seated, sprinkled around. The day was hot, and heaps of flies, who were extending their inquisitive, adventurous prerequisitions into all the glutinous little glasses near Madame, fell dead at the bottom. Their death made no impression on the other flies out promenading, who looked at them with the coolest manner, as if they themselves were elephants or something far removed, until they met the same fate. Curious to think how heedless flies are. Perhaps they thought as much at court that sunny summer day. A figure entering the door threw the shadow on Madame Defarge, which she felt to be a new one. She laid down her knitting and began to pin her rose onto her headdress before looking at the figure. It was curious. The moment Madame Defarge took up the rose, the customers all ceased talking and began gradually to drop out of the wine shop. "Good day, madame," said the newcomer. "Good day, monsieur." She said this aloud, but added to herself as she resumed knitting, "Ha! Good day. Age about 40. Height about 5 feet 9. Black hair, generally rather handsome. Dark complexion, eyes dark. Thin, long, sallow face. Aquiline nose, but not straight. Good day, one and all." "Have the goodness to give me a little glass of old cognac and a mouthful of cool fresh water, madame." She complied with a polite air. "Marvelous cognac, madame." It was the first time it had ever been so complimented, and Madame Defarge knew enough of the accedents to know better. She said, however, that the cognac was flattered, and took up her knitting. The visitor watched her fingers for a few moments, and took the opportunity of observing the place in general. "You knit with great skill, madame." "I am accustomed to it." "A pretty pattern as well." "You think so?" said madame with a smile. "Decidedly. May I ask what it is for?" "Pastime," said madame, still looking at him with a smile, while her fingers moved nimbly. "Not for use?" "It depends. I may find use for it one day, if I do well," said madame, drawing a breath and nodding her head with a stern kind of coquetry. I'll use it." It was remarkable, but the taste of Saint Antoine seemed to be decidedly opposed to a rose on the headdress of Madame Defarge. Two men had entered separately, and had been about to order drink, when, catching sight of that rose, faltered, made a pretense of looking around as if for some friend who was not there, and went out again. Nor of those who had been there when the visitor entered was there a single one left. They had all dropped off. The spy had kept his eyes open, but had been able to detect no sign. They had lounged away in a poverty-stricken, purposeless, accidental manner, quite natural. "John," thought madame, checking off her work as her fingers knitted and her eyes looked at the stranger, "stay long enough, and I shall knit Bessard before you go." "You have a husband, madame?" "I do." "Children?" "No children." "Business seems bad." "Business is very bad. The people are so poor." "Ah, the unfortunate, miserable people. So oppressed, as you say." "As you say," said madame, correcting him, and deftly knitting an extra something into his name that bode no good for him. "Pardon me. Certainly it was I who said so, but you naturally think so, of course." "I think," said madame, "I and my husband have enough to do to keep this wine shop open without thinking. All we think here is how to live. That is the subject we think of, and it gives us from morning to night enough to think on, without embarrassing our heads concerning others. I think for others? Oh, no, no. The spy, who was there to pick up any crumbs he could find or make, did not allow his baffled state to express itself in his sinister face, but stood with an air of gossiping gallantry, leaning his elbow on Madame Defarge's little counter and occasionally sipping his cognac. Ah, bad business this, madame, of Gaspard's execution. Poor Gaspard. My faith, said madame, if people use knives for such purposes, they have to pay for it. He knew beforehand what the price of his luxury was, and he paid it. I believe, said the spy, dropping his voice to a tone that invited confidence, and expressing an injured revolutionary susceptibility in every muscle of his face. I believe there is much compassion and anger in this neighborhood touching this poor fellow, just between you and I. Is there? Said Madame vacantly. Is there not? Oh, here's my husband, said Madame Defarge. As the keeper of the wine shop entered at the door, the spy saluted him by touching his hat and saying with a smile, Good day, Jacques. Defarge stopped and stared at him. Good day, Jacques, said the spy, with not quite so much confidence or such an easy smile. You deceive yourself, monsieur, said the keeper of the wine shop. You mistake me for another. That is not my name. I am Ernst Defarge. It is all the same, said the spy. Good day. Good day, said Defarge. I was saying to madame, with whom I had the pleasure of chatting when you entered, that they tell me that there is, and no wonder, much sympathy and anger in Saint Antoine, touching the unhappy fate of poor Gaspard. No one has told me this, said Defarge. I know nothing of it. Having said that, he passed behind the little counter, and he stood with his hand on the back of his wife's chair, looking over that barrier at the person to whom they were both opposed, and whom either of them would have probably shot with great satisfaction. The spy, well used to his business, did not change his unconscious attitude, but drained his glass of cognac and took a sip of fresh water and asked for another glass of cognac. Madame Defarge poured it for him and took her knitting again, humming a little tune. You seem to know this quarter well. That is to say, better than I do, said Monsieur Defarge. Oh, not at all. But I hope to know it better. I am so profoundly interested in its miserable inhabitants, said the spy. Ha, said Defarge. The pleasure of talking with you, Monsieur Defarge, recalls to me, said the spy, that I have the honor of cherishing some interesting associations with your name. Indeed, said Defarge indifferently. Yes, indeed. When Dr. Manette was released, you, his old domestic, had charge of him, I know. He was delivered to you. You see, I am informed of the circumstances. That is a fact, certainly, said Defarge. He had had it conveyed to him in an accidental touch of his wife's elbow as she knitted and sung that it would be best for him to answer, but keep it short. It was to you, said the spy, that his daughter came, and it was from your care that his daughter took him, accompanied by a neat brown monsieur. How was he called in a little wig? Lorry, of the Bank of Tellson, over to England. That is a fact, said Defarge. Very interesting memories, said the spy.
I have known Dr. Manette and his daughter in England. Yes, said Defarge. You don't hear much about them now, said the spy. No, said Defarge. In effect, said Madame, looking up from her work and her song, we never hear about them. We receive the news of their safe arrival, and perhaps another letter, perhaps two, but since then they have gradually taken their road in life, and we ours, and have had no correspondence. Is that so, Madame? Said the spy. She is going to be married. Going? Said Madame. She was pretty enough to have been married long ago. You English are cold, it seems. Oh, you know that I am English? I perceive that your tongue is, said Madame. And what the tongue is, I suppose that the man is. He did not take the identification as a compliment, but he made the best of it and shrugged it off with a laugh. After a sip of his cognac, he added, Yes, Miss Manette is going to be married, but not to an Englishman. To one like herself is French by birth. And speaking of Gaspard, poor Gaspard. A curious thing. She is going to marry the nephew of Monsieur the Marquis, for whom Gaspard was exalted to that height of so many feet. In other words, she is marrying the present Marquis. But he lives unknown in England. He is no Marquis there. He is Mr. Charles Darnay. D'Aulnoy is the name of his mother's family. Madame Defarge knitted steadily. But the intelligence had a palpable effect upon her husband. Do what he would behind the little counter, as to the striking of a light and the lighting of his pipe, he was troubled, and his hand shook. The spy would have been no spy if he had failed to see or record that in his mind. Having made at least this one hit, whatever it might prove to be worth, and no customers coming in to help him to any other hits, Mr. Bassard paid for what he had drunk and took his leave, taking the occasion to say, in a genteel manner before departing, that he looked forward to the pleasure of seeing Monsieur and Madame Defarge again. For some minutes after he had emerged into the outer presence of Saint Antoine, the husband and his wife remained exactly as he had left them, in case he came back. Can it be true? Said Defarge in a low voice, looking at his wife. What he has said of Mademoiselle Manette? As he has said it, said Madame. It is probably false, but it may be true. If it is, said Defarge, and then he stopped. If it is, said his wife. And if it does come, well, we live to see it triumph. I hope for her sake that destiny keeps her husband from France. Her husband's destiny, said Madame Defarge, will take him where he is to go, and will lead him to the end that is to end him. That is all I know. But it is very strange. Now, at least it is not very strange, said Defarge, almost pleading with his wife to get her to admit it, that after all our sympathy for Monsieur and her father and herself, that her husband's name should be prescribed under your hand at this very moment by that side of the infernal dog who has just left us. Stranger things than that will happen when it does come, said Madame. I have them both here of a certainty, and they are both here for their merits. That is enough. She rolled up her knitting when she said those words, and took the rose out of the handkerchief wound about her head. Either Saint Antoine had an instinctive sense that the decoration was gone, or Saint Antoine was on the watch for its disappearing, because now the saint took courage to lounge in very soon afterwards, and the wine shop got its habitual customers back. And we have another picture.
It is Monsieur, Madame, and the Spy, I do believe. In the evening, at which season of all others Saint Antoine turned himself inside out and sat on doorsteps and window ledges and came to the corners of vile streets and courts for a breath of air, Madame Defarge, with her work in hand, was accustomed to pass from place to place, from group to group, like a missionary. There were many like her, such as the world will do never to breed again. All the women knitted. They knitted worthless things, but the mechanical work was a mechanical substitute for eating and drinking. The hands moved for the jaws and digestive apparatus. If the bony fingers had been still, well, then the stomachs would have been more famine-pinched. But as the fingers went, the eyes went, and did the thoughts. As Madame Defarge moved from group to group, all three went quicker and fiercer among every little knot of women that she spoke with and left behind. Her husband smoked at his door, looking after her with admiration. "A great woman," he said. "A strong woman, a grand woman, a frightfully grand woman." Darkness closed around, and then came the ringing of church bells and the distant beating of the drums of the royal guard as the women sat knitting, knitting. Darkness encompassed them. Another darkness was closing in as surely when the church bells, then ringing pleasantly in an airy steeple over France, should be melted into a thundering cannon, when the drums should be beating to drown a wretched voice, that night all potent as the voice of power and plenty, freedom and life. So much was closing in about the women who sat knitting, knitting, that they their very selves were closing in around a structure yet unbuilt, where they were to sit knitting and knitting as they counted dropping heads. And that is the end of chapter 16, where it seems the voice of revolution is beginning to sing. I can't help it. Every time there's something in this book, it just reminds me so much of Les Miserables. And that is just the soundtrack that is going through my head. So right there with the whole knitting thing, I could just hear "Do You Hear the People Sing?" So play that in your own mind if you know the song, and we can just, I won't sing it because if I'm lisping when talking, I definitely know I couldn't sing, even if I could sing in real life, which I'm not good at. Anyway, that was pretty good. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for putting up with any mispronunciations. Wow, I mispronounced mispronounce. And thank you for putting up with everything else. Please do hit the thumbs up on your way out. It does always make me smile. And I will see you, fingers crossed, tomorrow.